They were a glamorous couple, living their best life.
It seemed like they had it all.
They had designer things, luxury items.
They were living the American dream.
Until one night, their dream life became a nightmare.
911, where's your emergency?
A woman was kidnapped.
They find the cars engulfed in flames.
There's a body, charred beyond recognition. It was all over the news. The Newark community was just scared.
In a neighborhood that's pretty well off, people don't get killed here.
But as the investigation unfolds, it turns out everything about this successful suburban couple wasn't what it seemed.
I heard rumors they were part of a gang.
It's a business where you always got to be watching your back.
Be careful who you associate yourself with, because you never know what lurks in the back.
October 28th, 2008. It's a quiet Tuesday in Greenbrook, New Jersey, an upscale community of 7,000 just an hour southwest of Manhattan.
Greenbrook is a very suburban area. These are million-dollar homes with 3-car garages.
But at 8 p.m. that night, a shocking 911 call shatters Greenbrook's safe and serene facade.
911, where's your emergency?
There's an incident right next door.
What kind of incident?
Possibly a woman was taken.
She's taken as in kidnapped or?
Kidnapped, taken.
According to the caller, her neighbor, 32-year-old Abraham Jones, is claiming his girlfriend has just been abducted.
He went over to the neighbor, alerted them to what had happened.
The gentleman was relaying to the neighbor and then to the dispatcher.
Hold on one moment, please. I'm going to put you on the phone with him.
Once on the phone, Abraham identifies his girlfriend as 35-year-old Tanya Worthy and gives a panicked explanation of her disappearance.
She's at a restaurant in Newark.
And she never, at what time was she supposed to be home?
She kept saying she told me she was going to be there. She kept saying she's going to come. She's coming. She's coming.
Of course, cars flying all the time. So be advised.
An hour and a half, so I called the
Sounds
restaurant.
like this is going to be a female that has not returned home. She was not abducted
told me
from the
that
residence.
she had left.
Okay.
So then I'm upstairs. I hear the garage door open.
However, according to Abraham, when Tanya's car pulled into their garage, it wasn't his girlfriend who got out of the car.
When I opened the door, I see 2 guys with the guns. So I closed the door, locked the door. They must have thought the alarm was on, so they hauled.
He just slammed the door, and he locked the back door, and then they left, and he ran out the house.
But then he said he never saw her in the vehicle.
And now, Abraham says he fears the worst.
They got her car. That's what I'm telling you. Something happened to it. Oh, my God.
At just 35 years old, Tanya Worthy was proud of all that she had achieved.
Tanya has it going on. She is very successful. She's educated.
She worked for DeVry University as a recruiter and had started her own company.
She also had a side business where she was a party planner.
Whatever was going on where you could be successful and it was lucrative, she was part of it.
But her path to success hadn't always been an easy one, having grown up in Newark.
Newark, it's actually been considered one of the most dangerous cities in New Jersey.
You have to be tough to live in Newark.
She came from a great family who had instilled the value of education and the value of working hard to make the kind of life that you wanted to make.
She just always knew she just wanted more.
She wasn't satisfied with necessarily a picket fence. She wanted a gold fence.
And she'd worked hard to achieve her dreams.
She got her business degree from Rutgers.
She graduated with honors.
She understood if you have a dream, stick with it. And nobody can tell you that you can't do something.
While Tanya's career was fulfilling, she had also known heartbreak.
She used to be married to a New Jersey state trooper.
They were a match made in heaven, seriously. And to see them two together, you would definitely say, wow, they're a beautiful couple. He just completed her.
However, sadly, their romance was cut short when in August of 1999, her husband died in a tragic off-duty motorcycle accident.
That shattered her world, because they wasn't even married a year yet.
Tanya did her best to cope with the tragedy.
She threw herself back into work.
Sometimes tragedy can push you harder, and I think that she was running full steam trying to be successful.
She was just starting over in life.
Tanya never thought she would find love again, but that all changed with a chance encounter at a local convenience store in 2006.
She met a guy there. His name was Abraham.
After exchanging numbers, Tanya and Abraham quickly started dating and became a couple.
Everybody gravitated towards Tanya. She was very sexy. She had beautiful long hair, loved her nails. She loved red lipstick.
Tanya was just as drawn to Abraham.
They grew on each other. So she was like-minded.
And they clicked off pretty well. Things got pretty serious.
He was a little younger. He was a nice young man. You know, he was living his life, and he was popular in the surrounding area.
And like Tanya, he also had a drive to succeed.
He was into real estate. They were in business together. They bought properties throughout the surrounding area.
With their careers booming, Tanya and Abraham bought a new house for themselves in the winter of 2007, just outside of Newark in the suburban community of Greenbrook.
Tanya and Abraham had it all. They had the big house, luxury cars, the nice clothes.
They'd built a life most people would envy. Now, barely a year after the couple moved into their dream home, Abraham has called 911 to report an unimaginable crime.
They was in her car. They got her car. That's what I'm telling you. Something happened, so they have her car.
Abraham was telling police dispatch that there were two men, that they were armed. They came to his house and Tanya's car.
They came to your house here? Came all the way to my house, yes.
But, according to Abraham, they didn't get inside.
I just shut the door real fast, and I locked the door.
Abraham tells the dispatcher after he was safely inside, the men fled, and one of them left in Tanya's car.
Okay, do you have any idea who may have taken her?
I don't know it. Oh, my God.
Greenbrook police respond immediately to the 911 call.
In Greenbrook, just like any other suburban area, kidnappings aren't common. It's one of those things that kind of shakes the neighborhood.
As the investigation unfolds, it will become obvious there is more to this abduction than meets the eye.
When somebody's missing and foul play is suspected, the significant other is generally looked at as the primary person.
Could the abduction story be a lie, told to keep investigators from learning the truth?
Homicide detectives are looking keenly at Abraham.
After the tragic death of her husband, 35-year-old Tanya Worthy found happiness again with 32-year-old real estate entrepreneur Abraham Jones.
They complimented each other. He grew from being with her, and I think she also grew from being with him.
But on the evening of October 28th, Abraham calls 911 from his neighbor's home to report that a pair of armed men had abducted Tanya.
How many men were there?
I think it was two.
All right, Cars, further information. The male believes that his female was abducted by somebody in Newark. A couple of armed men, armed with handguns, came up to his house. They came down and opened the garage door, seen the armed men, and they ran back into the car, getting in the direction of travel now.
As officers race to the scene, dispatchers also advise police to issue a be on the lookout for Tanya's vehicle.
Their primary objective at that point is Tanya's safety. We have a person that's missing, and we need to find her to make sure she's still alive and she's unharmed.
The search for Tanya and her car is already underway when officers arrive at her suburban home, where they find Abraham waiting outside.
You could hear the panic in his voice, frantically trying to relay this information, that they took her.
Once he's composed himself, Abraham tells officers he'd last spoken to Tanya about 3 hours earlier.
The statement that Abraham gave to police was that he spoke to her around 5 o'clock in the evening, right around the time before she left work to pick up food.
And he realized that the time had got so far away, like it doesn't take this long to get food to go and come on in. So he began to call her and wasn't getting an answer.
Abraham says that as his calls continued to go unanswered, he became increasingly worried.
So he started worrying in that moment.
The anxiety is rising, because this isn't normal for Tanya. If the phone rings, she's picking up.
Then it started going straight to voicemail. Then he called the actual restaurant to see if she was there.
According to Abraham, he was told Tanya had ordered the food, stepped outside, and never came back.
He would be thinking, well, what's going on? And then when he hears the garage door open, finally she's home.
After waiting for Tanya for so long and not having any contact with her, he hears the car pull up. He's excited. He's not only hungry, but he's relieved that she's finally home.
Abraham says his relief had turned to horror when he opened the door to the garage.
This is not her. He sees two guys.
He saw two individuals pointing a weapon. He ran back into the house, locked the door.
You gotta think that either they have her kidnapped or they could have hurt her by now.
Or maybe he just made up a whole story. Either way, I think we were still in fear.
They took a car. They must have done something.
Do you happen to know of anybody who might wanted to hurt Tanya?
No, nobody.
Did you recognize either of the guys?
No, sir.
Did you get a good look at him? No, it happened too fast.
Tanya didn't have any enemies. There was no one out there who would wanted to harm her, hurt her, like she was a loving person. Anyone who came in company with her, they loved her.
She's a prominent member of the community.
If the kidnapping story was true, could Tanya have been a victim of her own success?
Tanya wasn't afraid to use the money. She loved nice cars, nice clothes. She bought a big, expensive house, so she lived it up.
Was it possible that Tanya had been robbed at gunpoint and the assailants decided to raid her home for an even bigger haul? When questioned about the identity of the suspects, Abraham says it all happened too fast for him to get a good look.
Abraham didn't recognize the individuals. They were wearing hoodies.
When detectives and CSIs arrive, they immediately look over the garage.
They take a lot of pictures. They check the scene out for any evidence that may be around the surrounding area. They cordon off the area so that other people can't interfere with the crime scene.
But despite their best efforts, they're unable to generate any leads.
We had no physical evidence at the scene.
The mystery gunman had come and gone without leaving a trace behind. At least none that the detectives can find.
They searched the area out for cameras anywhere nearby. We didn't have that.
Detectives also speak to the neighbor who initially called 911.
Did it strike you as odd that he didn't call 911 himself?
It did. But it was happening so fast, there was no time. He needed help right away.
And you didn't see or hear anything prior to that?
Nothing.
She too is frantic and wondering what is indeed going on. Two armed men with hoodies, who Abraham believes were from Newark, were at his home, trying to get into his home.
And the news is about to get much worse.
Around 11 p.m. that night, the call came in that there was a car fire by Newark Airport.
The car is engulfed in flames, and it matches the description of Tanya's car that Abraham had given police.
They don't know what they have, but once firefighters put out the fire, they make this horrific discovery.
There's a body slumped over in the back seat.
Just 3 hours into the investigation of the alleged kidnapping of 35-year-old Tanya Worthy, firefighters in New Jersey are called to the scene of a reported car fire near Newark Airport.
The fire department arrived, they put out the car fire, and they discovered that there was a body in the car.
It had been burned pretty much beyond recognition.
Once it was established that the body was in the car, the next step is to run the place to identify the car of the owner.
The car is registered to Tanya Worthy.
When it comes to a car fire, investigators, their antennas go up, especially if the description of the car matches the bolo that they had.
Homicide detectives are notified and arrive on the scene soon after.
The sheriff's department, the ID unit, they go out there and they cordon off the area. It was pretty clear at the scene that it wasn't an accident.
Being that the car was burnt and it had the body inside of it, it means that whoever's responsible was trying to get rid of the evidence.
But there is no way detectives can ID the body based on its current condition. However, with an open investigation into Tanya's disappearance and the burnt car being registered to her, they have a pretty good idea who the victim is.
You're going to have to take out DNA and examine dental records to find out who was slumped over in the back seat of this burning vehicle.
Detectives' next step is to canvass the area in hopes that someone saw something. But they come up empty-handed.
We had a homicide with no witnesses.
The body from the charred vehicle is transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. And it's not long before they confirm the identity.
It was determined that that body was that of Tanya's.
The news is the worst-case scenario for Tanya's family.
I was devastated. I couldn't even think straight. I mean, why? Those were the questions asked. Why her? For what?
While the family wants answers, detectives have plenty of questions of their own that may help solve Tanya's murder. Mainly, when and how did Tanya die?
There wasn't any smoke in her lungs. She was actually dead at the time of the fire.
She was shot 3 times in the upper torso.
Now that detectives have the cause of death, their focus is on finding who pulled the trigger and why. Their best hope is to re-interview the man who nearly fell victim himself, Tanya's boyfriend, Abraham Jones.
Abraham was the only one that's seen the assailants.
It's almost dawn by the time homicide detectives sit down with Abraham for a formal statement.
Can someone tell me what's going on?
We found Tanya's car near the airport. The vehicle was on fire and her body was inside.
The news that Tanya has been brutally murdered hits Abraham hard.
He was frantic, and you could hear it in his voice when he was speaking to the police. You could hear the agitation in his voice. It seemed like he was about to cry.
But detectives have to wonder, is Abraham really as distraught as he appears?
You have these 2 armed men that supposedly drove all the way to your house, and they come there, and you close the door, and they just give up, which didn't make any sense. Why come all that way and just be stopped by a door?
But with Tanya and her car found burning 23 miles away from their Greenbrook home, it seems that if Abraham was involved in Tanya's murder, he didn't act alone.
Was he trying to cover up some kind of hit?
In this particular case, they're suspecting him of the actual kidnapping. Investigators push a little hard with Abraham.
During the interview, detectives walk Abraham through his account of the attempted home invasion multiple times.
And you didn't see Tanya in the back seat?
No. Once I seen that gun, I ran aside and slammed the door.
And you didn't call 911 once you were locked in the house?
I heard him speed off, and I just panicked.
Detectives' biggest question is why Abraham didn't call police from his own home.
They're curious about why he decided to leave his home and make the 911 call from a neighbor's home.
Most people call 911 right from the house.
Was Abraham purposefully bringing in a witness in hopes of adding credibility to his story? He insists that's not the case.
I don't know what to tell you. I just know I needed help.
It's retreat mode, you know. He's got to worry about his safety.
However, there is a lot about Abraham's story that detectives aren't buying.
A homicide, usually the person is targeted. That's not random when a person's killed like that. So it makes you question what else is going on.
Pressed even harder by detectives, Abraham comes clean.
It's something I should have told you before.
He admits he's on bail, currently awaiting sentencing on federal drug charges.
There may be more to this case than detectives can imagine.
Just hours after New Jersey police find Tanya Worthy deceased in the burnt-out remains of her BMW, detectives learn shocking new information about her boyfriend, Abraham Jones.
It's something I should have told you before.
What is that?
As homicide detectives are delving more into this case, they learned that Abraham is awaiting sentence on federal drug charges.
They find out that Abraham is dealing in drugs. Now you have this factor of there are people that want his money.
There's a lot of questions to be answered. The motivation, of course, was robbery, but there's got to be some type of connection.
With federal charges pending against Abraham, detectives suspect that Tanya at least knew about his legal troubles and wonder if maybe she knew too much.
And Tanya knew that?
She did.
Was there anything that you didn't want her to know?
What do you mean?
Was she gonna testify against you?
No. Look, if this had anything to do with my business, someone was just trying to pull a lick. This had nothing to do with Tanya.
Abraham is adamant that he loved Tanya and that she wasn't involved in that side of his life.
It was unfortunate she was involved with a person who was involved with drugs, because she was a good person. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she couldn't and wouldn't date someone who might have had a tawdry past. But she was not in any way involved with the wrong side of the law.
Abraham says Tanya even pushed him to get out of that lifestyle.
She wanted me to quit. I just didn't listen.
She was a good businesswoman. She worked hard, and she was trying to save him from that type of life.
Detectives now have to answer the question, had Abraham's business led to Tanya's death?
It's not uncommon within the drug trade that people try to rob drug dealers.
It's part of the job hazard with people. They want your money, and it's quick money. And there's a possibility that you won't report it because drug dealers won't report missing drugs and money. So they know he's dealing drugs, they know it's a lot of money, and this could be the reason why Tanya was kidnapped.
Still, despite the possibility that the murder may have been drug-related, detectives aren't ready to cross Abraham off as a suspect just yet.
Everybody was a suspect at this point.
Despite his claims to the contrary, perhaps Tanya knew too much about Abraham's illegal business, and he used his connections to have her killed. Detectives now need to verify Abraham's claim that he called the restaurant looking for Tanya. Over the phone, they interview the server who helped Tanya the previous evening.
Tanya was one of those customers that the employees always recognized.
It was a hangout. We would sit in the back bar, and we knew everybody by their first name.
The server says Tanya was acting normal, and nothing seemed off about their interaction. But she does give detectives one critical piece of information.
Tanya puts the order in, then she goes out because she received a phone call.
She said she was going to come back.
But Tanya never returned for her order. So at least that part of Abraham's story appears to check out.
The police want to know who's the last person that she was talking to, who was the last call.
Next, detectives subpoena Tanya's phone records.
They want to be looking at who's the last person that she was in communication with.
The last known phone call she made could lead detectives to her killer, or at the very least, reveal something that they don't know. While waiting for the records, detectives sit down with the family that afternoon. They're still struggling to understand how this could have happened to Tanya.
A lot of people had a lot of great things to say about Tanya. Her minister, her co-workers, her family. She was well loved within that community.
However, if they had to name a suspect, there's only one person that comes to mind.
I think in that moment, we were like, it was her boyfriend. We was thinking maybe he was into something.
The family was well aware of Abraham's legal troubles.
Her new boyfriend was a challenge.
It's a bit ironic that she was married to a New Jersey state trooper, and then from there, she's, involved with a guy who deals drugs.
Detectives suspect Abraham's past put Tanya in the crosshairs of his illegal business. And less than 48 hours into the investigation, they will get a tip suggesting they are on the right track.
Homicide.
We received a call that Tanya Worthy's pocketbook, which was not at the scene, was given to a woman who was not involved in this homicide.
The woman received it as a gift from an individual by the name of Rashawn Bond.
Rashawn had a long rap sheet.
This guy is indeed a drug dealer.
With Rashawn's drug affiliations, detectives suspect he's somehow connected to Abraham.
Was it one of his rivals or something like that?
Was he hired by Abraham to take out Tanya?
Less than 48 hours after police find Tanya Worthy's dead body in the charred remains of her BMW, detectives investigating her murder have just identified a person of interest. 32-year-old Rashawn Bond.
Within a day or so, a call was made to the police department. And that person told us that Tanya Worthy's pocketbook was given to a woman by Mr. Bond.
The caller indicates the new owner of the bag is 28-year-old Stephanie Reed. Detectives immediately track her down and bring her in for questioning.
Stephanie's brought in and starts to talk to the homicide detectives to tell them the circumstances in which she received this Gucci handbag. She received this gift, and she was excited to receive it. She looked it over, and within it, there was a card, a business card. And you know whose name was on it? Tanya's.
Now, this case was being broadcast on all of the channels. It was a bad case, so they recognized the name, that it was a woman that was abducted and murdered.
They were wondering how on earth did Rashawn come in possession of what appeared to be Tanya's Gucci bag.
Stephanie also reveals to detectives that Rashawn had asked to borrow her car the night Tanya disappeared.
Rashawn had not only borrowed the car, but he kept it for an inordinate amount of time.
Now that raises antennas.
Tanya's car fire had been called in around 11 p.m., just an hour before Stephanie says Rashawn returned with her car.
She was really upset about the fact that he kept her car so long. He gave her this Gucci purse to smooth things over, and she was cool with it until she discovered Tanya's card in it.
Could Rashawn be the missing link that detectives need to zero in on Tanya's killer?
Every homicide, you hope for a break. We got it.
And when detectives received Tanya's phone records later that afternoon, it looks like their big break has panned out.
Lo and behold, on the day that Tanya went missing, there were multiple phone calls between Rashawn and Tanya.
Once investigators learned that Rashawn was the one that talked to Tanya around the time she was last seen, they feel like they're on the right track.
However, that phone call at the restaurant isn't all Tanya's records reveal.
Investigators learned that there's been some type of relationship between Rashawn and Tanya.
In fact, there were multiple calls between the two in the weeks prior to her death.
They're trying to understand exactly what the relationship was.
Detectives also look for any connection between Rashawn and Tanya's drug dealer boyfriend, Abraham Jones.
Was he hired by Abraham to take out Tanya? Was Rashawn Bond part of Abraham's network?
Maybe he co-conspired with Rashawn, who knows? So they're looking to see if there's any relation there.
Rashawn's phone calls to Tanya give detectives an opening to find out.
That gave us the probable cause to get the search warrant of Mr. Bond's phone calls.
Detectives wade through dozens and dozens of calls and texts, but none of them can be traced to Abraham.
He had no contact with Rashawn.
Detectives run Rashawn Bond's name through their database and find a possible connection.
They run his rap sheet and they realize he could have been affiliated with the Bloods gang or even the Southside Cartel. There are gangs in Newark, especially I think they have a strong presence of the Bloods.
To find out what the connection is between Rashawn and Abraham, they decide to bring Rashawn in for questioning.
Need some information from you, Rashawn. How can I help?
In the interrogation room, they expect him to deny any involvement. But once they mention Tanya Worthy, Rashawn changes his tone.
We know you were the last person to talk to Tanya before she got kidnapped.
I never meant for her to get hurt.
He wanted to let homicide investigators know that he had nothing to do with pulling the trigger. And he was eager to let him know that he loved Tanya, that they were involved in some kind of affair.
Rashawn claims that he'd met Tanya in August, almost 3 months before the murder, and they quickly began a relationship.
Rashawn developed feelings and started thinking maybe he was in love.
Rashawn says that as his affair with Tanya heated up, people started to notice, including one of his friends, Jamel Lewis.
Jamel and Rashawn, they knew each other from Newark.
Jamel Lewis was also a well-known drug dealer.
He kept pressing me about wanting to pull a lick on Abraham. I thought he was kidding, but he just kept coming at me about it.
According to Rashawn, not only did Jamel know Abraham Jones, he also knew Tanya was living with Abraham. Once Jamel found out Rashawn knew Tanya, he saw an opportunity.
He thought this guy, he keeps money in the house.
Abraham had large sums of money in the home, tens of thousands of dollars. So they decided, hey, let's set Tanya up and let's just go to the house and take the money. But Rashawn is trying to convince homicide detectives that he never wanted anything to happen to Tanya.
Rashawn says it was all Jamel's idea.
Rashawn was trying to say he wanted nothing to do with it.
But Rashawn also tells detectives he didn't have a choice.
I had feelings for her, but he just wouldn't let it go. He said it'd be bad for me if I didn't help. Help set Tanya up? Yeah.
Rashawn tried to claim that he was being forced into this.
He just tells him he had threatened to kill him.
So you called her and asked her to come over? Yeah.
Then what happened?
After the brutal murder of 35-year-old Tanya Worthy, detectives have their main suspect, 32-year-old Rashawn Bond, in for questioning.
Bond did indicate that he had an intimate relationship with Tanya.
Rashawn tells investigators that his friend Jamel Lewis knew about the affair and knew of Tanya's boyfriend, so he hatched a plan to rob him for some quick cash.
They come with this idea, well, we should rob him. So kidnapping her and going to the house.
He really didn't want to do this, but Jamel Lewis threatened his life.
On the evening of October 28th, 2008, Rashawn says that they put Jamel's plan into motion.
Call her up, man. Just wait.
Man, just do it.
Damn.
Rashawn called Tanya. He got Tanya to come to his apartment.
Hey, what you doing?
Just picking up some food. What's going on?
Rashawn says when he called Tanya, she was at a restaurant picking up food for herself and Abraham. But he convinced her to come over.
Okay, I'm on my way.
And that after they hung up, she drove to his apartment.
Rashawn lured Tanya to his apartment.
Then minutes after she arrived, Jamel rushed in behind them and took Tanya hostage at gunpoint.
Oh my God, Rashawn, what's happening?
Shut up! It'll be okay. Just do what he says. Move.
They staged this robbery to look like he and her were both the victims.
They wanted to make it look like Rashawn had nothing to do with what was about to unfold.
He just wanted to make some quick cash. It wasn't supposed to go that far.
Rashawn kept to his statement that she wasn't supposed to get killed.
Rashawn says that next, Jamel forced Tanya out of the apartment and back into her car, then sped off. After they'd left, Rashawn says he grabbed Tanya's purse that she'd left behind and then made the drive to her house in the car he borrowed from Stephanie Reed. Rashawn says he made several calls to Jamel during his drive to Tanya's house, trying to convince him to not go through with his plan.
He was trying to tell him not to do it.
But if that was true, why did he follow Jamel to her house?
He's the getaway guy. He borrowed Stephanie's car to rendezvous somewhere out at the airport.
Rashawn says when he arrived at Tanya's house, he parked by the road and followed Jamel into the garage on foot while Tanya was tied up in the back seat.
They just wanted to set her up, take Abraham's money, and leave. But things went really wrong that night.
When was Tanya killed?
I don't know. I didn't see it. She was alive when he took her from my apartment. I never saw her again.
Rashawn claims he never witnessed Jamel shoot Tanya or burn her vehicle. But detectives are left wondering which, if any, of Rashawn's claims are true. Were he and Tanya lovers? Tanya's family says no.
I would have knew that firsthand. He never even dated Tanya.
We knew that they were friendly, but that there was an intimate relationship. We never proved that.
Ultimately, how Rashawn and Tanya know each other makes no difference to prosecutors.
Rashawn was arrested and charged with Tanya's murder, the arson, the robbery, and gun charges. Felony murder makes those involved in the commission of a crime responsible for everything that takes place during the course of committing that crime. If you're involved in a robbery and someone happens to get killed, even if you didn't pull the trigger, you're responsible for the murder.
When Rashawn goes on trial in April of 2014, prosecutors make it clear the murder never would have happened if it weren't for Rashawn.
He's kind of a linchpin of the whole thing. He knew she had money. He knew she lived in a home which was purported to be worth close to $1 million. So he knew that there was some money there.
He's the one who lured Tanya to his apartment.
He's the person that had her property, had her back.
Rashawn is also the one who made arrangements to pick up Jamel after the robbery. Prosecutors maintain there is no denying his involvement.
We've got the information about the cell phone contact. We've got Tanya's purse with Tanya's card in it.
But does that make Rashawn Bond a killer? When he takes the stand in his own defense, Rashawn says no.
He never took ownership. He never said that he murdered her. He made it sound as if he was a victim.
He claimed his life was threatened.
Rashawn is trying to take no responsibility for the harm that came to Tanya.
But will Rashawn's claim that he was coerced make an impression on the jury?
It's a hard fence to buy, given all the circumstances.
Whether they were romantically involved or not doesn't matter. He's still involved. He's the connection.
And when they hand down their verdict, it's obvious that the jury agrees.
The jury didn't buy his claims of innocence.
He was found guilty of murder and kidnapping. The jury made that decision that he wasn't forced into anything, that he was a voluntary participant.
At his sentencing hearing, Rashawn continues to plead his innocence.
He's sobbing. He's tearful about what has happened to Tanya. He's trying to let the judge know that he had no idea that she was going to be killed. But the judge didn't buy it either.
The judge sentences Rashawn to life in prison.
There's no getting out of this. Rashawn is just as responsible, and under the eyes of the law, he's guilty.
When Jamel Lewis goes on trial a few months later, the man Rashawn blamed for Tanya's death is also found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
When they were finally sentenced, it was a relief. They took an innocent woman's life.
Tanya's family hopes her story will serve as a cautionary tale.
I would just hope that people would learn from this.
There's so many wolves out here. Be careful who you associate yourself with.
Although despite her devastating loss,
the rain in 1985 didn't just wash the streets of this sleepy, nameless town. It seemed to dissolve the very memories of the girl who vanished. She was 17, a photograph of radiant potential frozen in the yellowing frame of a high school yearbook, the kind of innocence that usually outlasts the harshness of the world. But that night, the world turned jagged. She didn't walk out of her house. She was erased from it. Her room remained undisturbed, the half-finished homework on the desk. The radio still hummed to the static of a midnight frequency, yet the girl was gone. It was a cold case born not of violence alone, but of a silence so heavy it felt intentional, a shroud cast over a community that preferred to look away rather than confront the shadow growing in its own backyard. The investigation at the time was a frantic, uncoordinated scramble, a series of dead-end leads that dissolved like smoke in the autumn air. For decades, the local precinct held onto the file, a box of brittle documents and faded Polaroids that grew dustier with each passing year, a bureaucratic tomb for a life that deserved a resolution. The town moved on, as towns do, burying the trauma beneath the noise of daily survival, but the secret remained, festering in the dark, waiting for a catalyst to drag it back into the harsh, judgmental light of the present. The house where she last drew breath sits at the end of a winding lane, an architectural witness to a tragedy that defied explanation for 32 long years. Detectives who returned to the property found the same floorboards, the same layout, the same oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to the walls like a second skin. It wasn't the physical evidence that had failed them, but the human element, the subtle, terrifying realization that the culprit wasn't a phantom or a drifter, but someone woven into the fabric of the victim's existence. The forensic sweep of the mid-'80s had been primitive, a blunt instrument trying to solve a delicate, surgical act of betrayal. They had missed the micro-details, the tiny, indelible signatures of presence that DNA science would eventually illuminate with the clarity of a flashbulb in a pitch-black room. As the new team sifted through the boxes, they weren't just looking for clues. They were hunting for a ghost, a presence that had been hiding in plain sight for an entire lifetime. Every photograph they pulled from the depths of the archive was a piece of a shattered mirror, reflecting a reality that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators, was prepared to acknowledge. It was a forensic hunt through the layers of time, where each discovery felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are the ones who share our dinner tables and our bloodlines. The investigation took a turn toward the impossible when the familial DNA markers began to surface, not as external contaminants, but as part of the very domestic scene they were reconstructing. The air in the lab grew thin, the technicians moving with a reverent, terrified focus as they realized the implications of what they were uncovering. It wasn't just a stray hair or a fiber on a carpet. It was the biological signature of someone intimately connected to the household, a bridge across the decades that led directly to the doorstep of the family itself. The realization didn't come with the fanfare of a cinematic reveal. It arrived as a cold, sinking sensation in the center of the chest. The narrative they had built, the story of a predator lurking in the dark, of a kidnapping gone wrong, of a stranger in the night, crumbled, leaving behind the stark, hideous truth of an internal betrayal. The detectives spent nights pacing the floor, the case files spread out like a map of a landscape they no longer recognized, their minds struggling to bridge the gap between the brother they had interviewed 30 years ago and the monster that science was now unmasking. The connection was undeniable, a genetic thumbprint left on the most private evidence, an error of arrogance that had waited 3 decades to be corrected by the unforgiving precision of the modern lab. The arrest was conducted in the dead of silence, a stark contrast to the frantic, screaming energy of the initial disappearance. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic standoff. There was only the metallic, final sound of handcuffs clicking shut around wrists that had once held the victim's hands in a gesture of familial love. As the suspect was escorted from his home, the neighbors watched from the darkness of their porches, their faces illuminated by the flickering red and blue of the patrol cars, a tableau of suburban shock that felt pulled from the pages of a nightmare. He didn't protest. He didn't scream for his innocence. He simply walked with the slumped, heavy gait of a man who had known this moment was inevitable, a prisoner of his own long-held secret, finally released from the suffocating pressure of his own performance. The town, which had spent years whispering rumors about the dark woods and the highway drifters, was suddenly forced to look at the man who had sat in the front row of every memorial, who had wept at the graveside, and who had campaigned for justice in his sister's name. The shock was not just an emotional response. It was a societal collapse, a total revision of everything they understood about their community and the people who lived within it. The interrogation room became a confessional of the damned, a space where the illusion of the grieving brother was dismantled, layer by excruciating layer. The tapes from those hours are filled with the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who has run out of walls to hide behind, his voice crackling with the dry, hollow resonance of a long-buried guilt. He spoke of the day, the moment, the shift in his own psyche that had led him to commit the act, his words spilling out like debris from a dam that had finally burst. He described the victim not as a sister, but as a hurdle, a secret, a person whose existence had become an obstacle to his own, carefully constructed reality. For the detectives, listening to his admission, it was the end of a journey that had spanned their entire careers, a culmination of thousands of hours spent chasing shadows that were, in truth, standing right in front of them the whole time. The motive was as banal as it was horrific, a collision of ego, jealousy, and the terrifying absence of empathy that allowed him to view his own flesh and blood as an expendable item in his life. News of the arrest traveled like a virus, infecting every household in the county with a sickening, visceral confusion. People who had grown up alongside the brother, who had shared school desks and playing fields with him, were forced to grapple with the realization that they had been blind to the malice hiding in their midst. The community didn't just feel anger. They felt a profound sense of violation, a feeling that the very sanctity of their domestic lives had been corrupted by a darkness that was homegrown. The story broke national headlines, the cold case label finally replaced by a headline that sounded like a warning: victim's brother arrested. It was the ultimate, horrifying plot twist, a revelation that turned the history of the town into a cautionary tale about the invisibility of evil. Every public encounter, every shared secret, every gesture of kindness in the town's history was now subject to a cold, retrospective reevaluation. Had they missed the signs? Could they have known? The answers were elusive, but the questions would haunt the community for the rest of their existence. The legal proceedings followed the rhythm of a slow, grinding machine, the courtroom becoming a theater for the exposition of a life lived as a lie. Each piece of evidence presented was a fresh wound, a new, grotesque detail that painted the suspect in colors of cold, calculating malice. The defense team tried to weave a narrative of mental instability, of a fractured personality, but the prosecution's case was a fortress built of cold, immutable biology. They had the science, they had the confession, they had the timeline of a crime that had been kept under the floorboards of his soul for 32 years. The victim's family, those who remained, were forced to relive the initial horror, their public grief becoming the backdrop for the dissection of their own history. The tragedy had come full circle, the brother who had claimed to seek justice for his sister now standing as the author of her destruction. As the judge delivered the sentencing, the atmosphere in the room shifted from the feverish energy of a spectacle to the heavy, stagnant air of an ending. The brother stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, his presence reduced to that of an object, a relic of a human being who had traded everything for a secret that had ultimately destroyed him. The gavel strike was not a resolution. It was a final, cold period on a sentence that had been written 32 years ago in blood. There was no joy in the gallery, only a heavy, nauseating sense of completion, a collective exhale that tasted of ash and regret. The cold case was solved, the box was closed, but the shadow that had been cast over the town remained, a dark stain that no amount of judicial action could ever fully erase. The victim was gone, and the justice served was only the meager, insufficient compensation for a life that could never be reclaimed, a void that would never be filled. In the aftermath, the town attempted to navigate a new reality, one where the familiar faces on the street were now viewed through a filter of lingering, inescapable suspicion. The tragedy had become a part of the town's landscape, an architectural ghost that sat in the background of every conversation and every relationship. Families sat down for dinner and spoke of the brother, his crimes, and the terrifying ease with which he had maintained his facade. The silence that had once protected the killer was replaced by a new kind of silence, one of mourning, of caution, and of a deep, pervasive confusion about the nature of those who surround us. They had uncovered the truth, yes, but the truth had not brought them peace. It had only clarified the extent of their shared, historical nightmare. The investigation's legacy was now etched into the records of the state, a study in the persistence of law enforcement and the ultimate, inevitable power of science to illuminate the dark. The detectives who had finally solved the case went home to their own families, their careers marked by this one, final, horrific victory. They knew that the case would be cited for years, a masterclass in forensic persistence, but for them, it would always be remembered as the story of the brother who had sat at the funeral, holding the victim's mother's hand while his own was stained with her daughter's blood. It was a story of the most profound, intimate kind of evil, the kind that hides not behind a mask, but behind the familiar, reassuring features of someone we have known our entire lives. And yet, as the dust settles and the headlines fade, the most haunting aspect of the entire affair remains the silence that now surrounds the house at the end of the lane. It is a silence that no longer protects a secret, but one that marks the void where a life should have been. The girl is remembered, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of everything that was lost to the calculated cruelty of her own blood. The town continues, the seasons change, the rain falls, but the shadow of 1985 remains, a permanent resident of the local consciousness. They have their justice, they have their answers, but they also have the enduring, crushing weight of knowing that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're sleeping in the room next door, their hearts beating in the same steady rhythm as our own, waiting for the night to turn, waiting for the perfect, terrible moment to strike. The case is closed, but the memory remains, an open wound that time refuses to heal, a reminder that the truth, no matter how long it stays buried, always eventually claws its way to the surface, demanding to be reckoned with. The forensic investigation moved into a phase of clinical, methodical dissection that felt less like a search for clues and more like the excavation of a life lived in reverse. Every piece of paper held in the archive, every witness statement from 1985, some of which had been handwritten on flimsy, yellowed pads, was digitized, magnified, and analyzed for the slightest flicker of dissonance. The detectives were no longer just looking at the crime. They were looking at the psychology of a household. They pored over family albums, their eyes tracking the subtle shifts in the suspect's expression in old photographs. There he was at the prom, at the dinner table, at the funeral, always standing just at the periphery of the frame, his body language a study and a detachment that, with the benefit of hindsight, looked less like grief and more like the calculated surveillance of a predator ensuring the success of his own performance. It was a harrowing exercise in retrospective analysis, where every smile was now read as a snarl, every gesture of support interpreted as a reinforcement of his alibi. The laboratory itself had become a theater of the microscopic. The technicians spent weeks extracting DNA from materials that had long been considered compromised by time, humidity, and the careless handling of the mid-80s. They were looking for the impossible, a match that would link the scene directly to the brother without the intervention of circumstantial interference. Every day was a test of patience, a slow, grinding process of filtration that felt as though they were trying to extract a single drop of truth from an ocean of entropy. The air in the facility was chilled, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of centrifuges and the intermittent, sharp sighs of the investigators. They were working on a deadline that was entirely of their own making, a self-imposed pressure to rectify 3 decades of failure, and the stakes felt like the weight of the world. Each day without a breakthrough was a day where the suspect remained a ghost, a presence that continued to haunt the community with his quiet, mundane existence. As the weeks bled into months, the investigators began to reach out to distant relatives, mapping the family's genetic geography in a way that had never been done before. This was the era of genetic genealogy, where family trees were no longer lines on a page, but interconnected webs of biological data. They tracked distant cousins, great-aunts, and second-removed kin, building a massive, intricate map of the familial DNA profile. It was a digital hunt that required a level of concentration bordering on the obsessive. They were looking for the link, the one commonality that would isolate the suspect's contribution from the general background noise of the family's identity. The screen of the investigators' computer became the focal point of the world, a glowing portal through which they hoped to find the key to the ironclad cage of the suspect's innocence. The breakthroughs began as small, seemingly insignificant correlations, tiny, statistical probabilities that suggested a genetic overlap which could only be explained by the presence of the brother's specific, unique profile at the crime scene. The detectives would sit in the dimmed light of the precinct, the glow of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows, and watch as the pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place with a terrifying, absolute certainty. The doubt that had been their constant companion for years began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. They were no longer chasing a theory. They were documenting a fact. The suspect had not just been present, he had been the architect. The forensic confirmation arrived as a definitive sequence, a string of nucleotides that read like a confession written in the most intimate, undeniable language of biology. Outside the laboratory, the detectives were orchestrating the final, silent trap. They needed to ensure that when they made their move, there would be no room for legal obfuscation, no opportunity for the suspect to slip through the gaps in the law. They monitored his movements with a quiet, persistent vigilance, watching him go to the store, go to work, go about the motions of a life that he had built on the foundation of a stolen one. It was a surreal experience for the officers, who were now observing a man they had once shaken hands with, a man who had looked them in the eye and lied about his own sister's death. The psychological weight of this surveillance was immense. They were essentially watching a monster live the life of a human, day after day, waiting for the precise moment when the law would finally provide the authority to stop him. The detectives began to prepare the legal documentation for the arrest warrant, a document that had to be as solid as a fortress. They laid out the timeline of the 1985 disappearance, the inconsistencies in the original testimony, and the incontrovertible biological evidence that had been synthesized through the modern lens. It was a masterpiece of investigative synthesis, a document that connected the disjointed fragments of a 32-year-old mystery into a single, cohesive narrative of guilt. As they read over the final draft, they knew that they were holding the end of the suspect's existence as a free man in their hands. The paper was dry, clinical, and bureaucratic, yet it felt like a holy text, a record of the moment when justice finally caught up to the rot that had been allowed to fester for so long. The team also began the delicate, painful process of alerting the remaining members of the family. This was the part of the job that never got easier, the responsibility of delivering the truth to those who had been the primary victims of the brothers' lifelong lie. They met them in the hushed, neutral surroundings of a local office, the detectives bracing themselves for the shock, the anger, and the inevitable, crushing grief that would follow. They explained the science, they showed the data, and they watched as the foundations of the family's history were shattered in real time. It was a moment of profound, painful clarity, a realization that the person they had loved, trusted, and relied on for years was the same person who had committed the ultimate, irredeemable sin. The detectives left those meetings with the weight of the family's agony pressing down on them, their resolve hardened into something colder, more permanent. In the final days before the arrest, the tension in the precinct reached a fever pitch. The officers were barely sleeping, the air in the room constantly thick with the energy of anticipation. They were preparing for the final tactical strike, mapping out the suspect's location, his habits, his surroundings, and the specific way he would react when he finally realized that the game was over. They were not just police officers. They were the instruments of a long-delayed reckoning, the agents of a truth that had been waiting for 3 decades to break through the surface of the earth. Every detail was planned, every variable accounted for, in an attempt to ensure that the process of justice would be as swift and as final as possible. The night before the arrest was eerily quiet, the town asleep under a sky that felt heavy with the weight of the coming revelation. The detectives were positioned at their desks, checking and rechecking the data one final time, the blue light of the screens illuminating their faces in a way that made them look like figures from an old, noir crime novel. They were the ones who had stayed behind when everyone else had forgotten, the ones who had stared into the void of the 1985 file, until the void finally stared back. They were the sentinels of the truth, and they knew that by this time tomorrow, the world would be fundamentally different. The secret that had been the heartbeat of the town's most enduring mystery would be out, and the brother who had walked among them as a pillar of the community would be unmasked as the monster he had always been. The moment of the final briefing, held in the harsh, sterile light of the early morning, was a study in grim focus. The team was primed, the tactical units briefed, and the path forward was laid out with the precision of a surgical intervention. There was no banter, no talk of the future, only the singular, driving intent to execute the warrant and bring the suspect into custody. They were the final chapter of a book that had been left open for too long, the executors of a justice that had been promised to the girl whose life had been snuffed out in the darkness of 1985. As they dispersed into the gray, pre-dawn light, they felt the full weight of the responsibility they carried, the collective hope of a family and a town that had waited for decades to hear the truth. The drive to the suspect's residence was a silent, intense pilgrimage through the landscape of the case. They passed the school, the church, the park, the geography of the victim's life, and each one felt like a milestone in the journey they were completing. The suspect's house appeared ahead, a nondescript, quiet building that looked entirely ordinary in the morning light. It was a home like any other, which was the very essence of the deception that had allowed him to thrive. As they pulled into position, the detectives took a deep breath, the air in the car feeling thin, charged with the energy of the moment they had spent years envisioning. The silence of the morning was about to be shattered, and the long, slow, and painful climb toward the truth was finally nearing its summit. They emerged from their vehicles, their movements fluid and practiced, the tactical gear providing a stark, visual contrast to the suburban stillness of a street. They approached the house with the focus of professionals, their hands hovering near their belts, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement, any indication that the suspect might be preparing for the end of his deception. They were the harbingers of the past, the ones who were finally bringing the bill for 1985 to be paid in full. As they neared the front door, the anticipation in their chests was a physical pressure, a reminder that they were not just serving a warrant, they were opening a door that could never be closed again. The truth, in all its cold, hard, and undeniable weight, was waiting on the other side, and they were the ones who would finally, after 32 years, force it into the light. The morning had arrived, and with it, the final, inevitable resolution of a cold case that had haunted the community for an entire generation. The door opened, not with the violence of a cinematic raid, but with the mundane, almost polite hesitation of a man who still believed he had control over his own reality. When he saw the tactical team, his face didn't crumple into the dramatic terror of a captured fugitive. Instead, it settled into a mask of hollow, porcelain stillness. He was a man who had practiced this moment in the theater of his own mind for 32 years, a rehearsal performed every time a knock echoed too loudly at the door or a police cruiser slowed down as it passed his house. The handcuffs went on, the cold, steel biting into the skin of the man who had long held the town in a state of suspended agony, and the sound was the final, resonant tolling of a bell that had been ringing in the distance since 1985. As he was led toward the patrol car, he didn't look back at the house, or the lawn, or the life he had built on the foundation of a stolen one. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a horizon that had finally, irrevocably shifted. The transport to the precinct was a journey through the geography of the investigation, passing the very landmarks that had defined the victim's short life. Each street corner was a memory, a snapshot of a time before the rot took hold, and for the detectives riding in the convoy, it felt as though they were witnessing a ghost being exorcised from the town. The atmosphere inside the patrol car was absolute, total silence, the kind of silence that exists in the heart of a tornado, where the destruction has already occurred and all that remains is the debris. The suspect, now stripped of his armor, seemed to shrink within the confines of the back seat, the gravity of his situation finally beginning to exert its pressure. He was no longer the brother, the pillar of the community, or the grieving sibling. He was the subject, the object, the man who had finally run out of runway. Inside the station, the interrogation room awaited, a sterile chamber of fluorescent lights and soundproofed walls that had seen the confession of 1,000 secrets. When he was finally seated, the table between him and the lead detective felt like a chasm that had been growing for decades. The detective sat down, placed the file on the table with a soft, deliberate thud, and said nothing. He simply watched, letting the silence do the work, letting the crushing weight of the sterile environment press down on the suspect's defenses. It was a psychological game of attrition, one the detective had spent years preparing for, and he could see the moment the brother's composure began to fray, the slight tremor in the hands, the way he avoided looking at the stack of evidence, the way he seemed to be holding his breath, as if afraid that breathing would cause the whole fragile structure of his life to collapse. The detective began the questioning not with accusations, but with facts, presenting the forensic narrative piece by piece. He spoke of the day in 1985, the humidity, the radio, the silence of the room, and the specific, damning evidence that had been recovered through the long, patient effort of the modern lab. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. He simply presented the reality of the crime, letting the suspect see the forensic trail he had left behind, the microscopic errors that had been overlooked 30 years ago but were now glaring, unavoidable truths. The brother sat there, his eyes tracking the photos, the charts, and the diagrams, and with every passing minute, the man who had maintained the lie for 3 decades began to vanish, replaced by the reality of the murderer who had been hiding in his skin all along. The confession, when it came, was not a cinematic explosion of grief or defiance. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling. He spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to be coming from the bottom of a well. He described the moment, the choice, the dark impulse that had driven him to commit the act, his words lacking any trace of remorse, only a strange, detached, and chillingly technical account of the final moments. He talked about the victim as if she were a piece of property, a hurdle to his own ambitions, his voice devoid of the humanity that should have been present when speaking of his own sister. The detectives listened, their pulses hammering in their ears, their professional detachment tested by the sheer, unadulterated malice of his words. It was as if they were listening to a man describe the dismantling of a machine, not the extinguishing of a soul. As the details emerged, the disposal of the remains, the planting of the false leads, the way he had watched the initial investigation from the sidelines, the room felt as though it was becoming smaller, the air thicker with the poison of his disclosure. He had been a master of his own environment, a manipulator of the people he had sworn to love, and as he spoke, he seemed to gain a perverse, twisted strength from the telling. It was his final act of control, his attempt to own the narrative one last time, even if that narrative was now a map to his own doom. The detectives recorded every word, their pens flying across the pages, their commitment to the record as absolute as the crime itself. They were writing the final, definitive history of the 1985 cold case, turning the chaos of a life of lies into the sterile, legal certainty of a confession. Outside the interrogation room, the precinct had become a hive of activity. The news of the confession was spreading through the halls, a jolt of electricity that left the entire staff in a state of professional shock. They had all known about the case. It was a cornerstone of the department's history, a source of collective, nagging failure that had finally been redeemed. Officers who had worked on the investigation years ago were hearing the news, their reactions a mix of bitter relief and deep, abiding sadness. They had stayed with it, they had fought the entropy of time, and they had finally, at the last possible moment, seen the truth break through. There were tears, there were toasts of cold coffee, and there was a profound sense that a long, dark chapter of the town's history had finally been brought to a close. The family, meanwhile, was in a state of complete, absolute collapse. The brothers' confession had not just solved a case, it had destroyed the history they had lived in. Every memory they had of the brother, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet evenings, was now a piece of a fraudulent existence. They had been living in a house of cards, and now that the wind had come, everything was gone. The detectives who had spoken to them earlier in the day were now returning, tasked with the heartbreaking job of informing them of the confession. They found the family huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes hollowed by the magnitude of the betrayal. There was no joy in the revelation, only a cold, sickening clarity that had arrived 32 years too late. The brother remained in the interrogation room, his energy spent, his narrative exhausted. He sat alone in the pool of light, a man who had finally run out of excuses, a man who had spent his life waiting for this exact, terrifying moment. He was finally a prisoner of his own past, the weight of the years crashing down on him with the force of an oncoming tide. The detectives left the room, the door clicking shut with a finality that signaled the end of the mystery. They walked out into the corridor, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the reality of the confession setting in like a change in the weather. The town, outside the walls of the precinct, was beginning to buzz with the rumor of the arrest, the silence of the morning being replaced by the rising, frantic noise of a community that was about to be confronted with the most horrific truth in its history. The long road from 1985 had finally ended. The cold case was, for all intents and purposes, a thing of the past. The brother, the suspect, the killer, he was now just a resident of the cell, a piece of the machinery of the law. The detectives could finally take a breath, the weight they carried for so long beginning to lift, replaced by the profound, exhausted satisfaction of having finished the job. They stood in the quiet of the office, the files of the 1985 case now stacked neatly on the desk, the evidence of the crime and the proof of the confession finally united. They had done the impossible. They had reached back through time and dragged the truth out of the dark. The brother had thought he could bury it. He had thought he could hide it in the light of his own ordinary life, but he had underestimated the persistence of the truth and the unwavering dedication of those who were sworn to protect it. As the night wore on, the precinct slowly emptied, the lights in the office turning off one by one, leaving only the steady glow of the computers. The case was closed, the records were finalized, and the town was left to sleep, unaware that by the time the sun rose, their world would be irrevocably changed. The secret was out, the betrayal was documented, and the shadow that had haunted the community for 32 years had been brought to light. It was a victory, but a bitter one. A reminder that the cost of justice is often the destruction of everything we once believed was true. The truth had set them free, but it was a freedom that tasted of salt and sorrow, a freedom that would require them to rebuild their understanding of the world from the ruins of their own shattered history. And as the dark finally gave way to the first, faint gray of the morning, the town remained in a state of expectant, terrifying silence, waiting for the news that would finally, and forever, tear the veil. The breaking of the news to the town was not a singular event. It was a cascading collapse of reality. As the morning light hit the streets, the silence of the suburb was shattered by the frantic, dissonant tone of local news broadcasts. For 32 years, the town had nurtured a version of events that centered on external threats, the passing stranger, the elusive drifter, the nameless danger of the highway. When the headlines flashed across screens and smartphone notifications, the dissonance was immediate. 1985 cold case solved, victim's brother arrested. The phrasing was clinical, but the impact was seismic. It was as if the bedrock beneath the town had suddenly turned to liquid. Neighbors emerged from their homes, not to talk, but to stand in stunned, quiet disbelief, staring at the street as if the very pavement had become treacherous. The shock was a physical presence, a weight that suppressed the normal sounds of morning traffic and school-bound chatter. At the epicenter of the chaos, the family home of the suspect and the victim became a site of pilgrimage for the curious, the grieving, and the morbidly fascinated. Media vans lined the street like metal sentinels, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky, broadcasting the grim, unfolding story to the rest of the nation. It was a secondary violation, a public autopsy of a tragedy that had once been the private, agonized secret of a single household. The residents of the street retreated behind their curtains, the safety of their domestic lives having been rendered illusory by the realization that the monster had been, for years, the man who waved from the end of the driveway. Every shared cup of coffee, every casual conversation about the weather, every gesture of neighborly support offered to the brother over the last 3 decades now felt like a sick, twisted farce. Inside the precinct, the detectives were fighting a different battle, the relentless, suffocating tide of public inquiry. The phones at the front desk didn't stop ringing. The emails flooded the servers, and the pressure from the national press became a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the walls of the office. They had moved from the quiet, analytical intensity of the investigation to the chaotic, performative demands of the public spectacle. They had to maintain the integrity of the evidence, protect the rights of the accused, and manage the emotional fallout of a community that was looking to them for an explanation that did not exist. There was no easy answer to the question of why. There was only the cold, mechanical reality of the confession. They were the ones holding the keys to the truth, and everyone wanted to reach through the bars to touch it, to try and understand how such a profound betrayal could exist within the familiar walls of a domestic life. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, the town's social fabric continued to fray. Conversations at the local grocery store, the hardware shop, and the cafe were no longer about the mundane details of daily survival. They were centered on the brother, his demeanor, his habits, the moments they had spent in his company. People were scouring their memories for clues, for the subtle, telltale signs that they had missed, the fragments of behavior that, in retrospect, seemed like flashes of true, unadulterated darkness. It was a collective exercise in self-reproach, a way of trying to make sense of the insensible by retrofitting their experiences with the terrifying new context of the truth. They were all complicit in a sense, having participated in the long, drawn-out performance of his innocence, and this realization gnawed at them, creating a deep, pervasive sense of unease. The victim's remaining family, sequestered away from the glare of the media, were navigating the most profound kind of grief, a grief that had been repurposed, refined, and finally betrayed. They weren't just mourning the loss of the girl, they were mourning the loss of the last 32 years of their lives. They had loved the brother, they had supported him, they had integrated him into the very heart of their existence, all while he carried the secret of his crime in his own pocket. The revelation was not just a heartbreak, it was a total, absolute negation of their shared history. Every photo of the brother on the mantle, every holiday gift exchanged, every word of comfort given, it was all a lie, a carefully managed performance of love that had served to shield him from the very consequences he had earned. They were left to wonder if they had ever truly known him, or if he had been an actor from the start, a parasite feeding on their affection while he maintained the facade of the grieving sibling. The legal and ethical questions began to dominate the public discourse. How did the justice system fail for so long? What were the failures in the original investigation that allowed the brother to escape scrutiny, and how had he managed to navigate the social life of the town without ever betraying the secret of his crime? The debates were sharp, heated, and often deeply personal. They touched on the limits of investigation, the fallibility of human intuition, and the terrifying ease with which a person can hide in plain sight. The case became a touchstone for the entire country, a story that captured the primal fear of the enemy within, the domestic threat that feels so much more visceral and personal than the shadow of an unknown killer. By the late afternoon, the town began to feel like a place under siege. The familiar, comforting rhythms of the suburb had been completely replaced by the chaotic, discordant energy of the crisis. Residents who had lived there for years felt like strangers, looking at their neighbors with a new, guarded suspicion. The trust that had allowed them to leave their doors unlocked, to let their children play in the yard, and to share their lives so openly was rapidly eroding. It was a structural collapse of community, a result of the realization that the most dangerous person in the room could be the one you loved the most. The brother hadn't just taken a life in 1985, he had effectively destroyed the foundation of the neighborhood, turning the quiet, predictable safety of the suburb into a landscape of unease and hesitation. The investigators, meanwhile, were finally taking a moment to look at the larger scope of what they had accomplished. They had closed the book, yes, but they were also the ones who had to live with the consequences of that closure. They knew that the case wouldn't end when the gavel fell. It would live on in the memories of everyone who had been touched by it. They felt the weight of their own responsibility, the knowledge that they had been the ones to pull the trigger on this revelation, and that the town would never, ever be the same again. They had been the harbingers of the truth, and they knew that the truth, as it is in the case of such profound betrayal, is a weapon that cuts both ways. As the dusk started to settle over the neighborhood, the atmosphere grew even more claustrophobic. The streetlights flickered to life, their pale, synthetic glow casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance with the ghost of the girl and the shadow of the brother. Every passing car seemed suspicious, Every slammed door seemed like a resonance of the past. Every shout in the distance felt like an echo of the original tragedy. The town was living in a suspended state, waiting for the night to pass, waiting for some kind of resolution that would allow them to breathe again. But they knew, on some level, that the resolution wasn't coming, at least not the kind they wanted. They were simply living through the first, most intense stage of a long, permanent, and fundamentally altered existence. The brothers' house, now cordoned off by yellow police tape, stood as a monument to the failure of their collective perception. It was the physical manifestation of the lie, the shell that had contained the secret of the 1985 cold case. People walked past it with their heads down, their pace quickened, as if the house itself were a source of contagion. It had become a focal point of their collective trauma, the anchor of the mystery they had finally solved but could never fully escape. The silence in the air, the heaviness of the atmosphere, and the persistent, nagging presence of the media were all the markers of a community that was undergoing a radical, irreversible change. In the final hours of the day, the detectives stood by their cars, looking out over the town they had served, the town that had just been irrevocably broken. They were tired, their minds full of the cold, clinical data of the confession and the raw, unedited agony of the family's reaction. They had done their jobs. They had followed the evidence to its conclusion, and they had brought the truth into the light. But as they looked at the sleeping suburb, they couldn't help but feel that they had only just begun to see the true cost of the crime. The case was solved, but the tragedy had just entered a new, and perhaps even more difficult, phase of existence. The town had been forced to witness the truth, and now they were left with the task of finding a way to live with it, a challenge that would test the resilience of every person in that community for as long as they remained together in the shadow of the past. The legal proceedings, once they commenced, functioned as a grueling, systematic dismantling of the suspect's carefully constructed reality. The courtroom was a theater of the inevitable, where the prosecution presented the truth not as an accusation, but as an undeniable physical record. Each piece of evidence, the DNA, the journals, the timeline, the forensic reconstruction, served as a brick in the wall that was closing in on the brother. Throughout it all, he remained a presence of chilling stillness. He did not look at the jury, he did not look at the gallery, and he most certainly did not look at the remaining members of his family, who sat together in the front row like figures carved from grief. It was as if he had already retreated into the shell of his own existence, a man who had long ago traded the richness of human experience for the cold, hollow comfort of a secret. The testimony from the forensic experts was perhaps the most devastating component of the trial. They took the stand one by one, their voices flat, technical, and utterly devoid of the emotion that was saturating the room. They walked the jury through the science of the 1985 sample, explaining how the markers they had isolated were not just similar to the brothers, they were his, a biological fingerprint that had been left in the very environment where the crime had occurred. The jury listened in a state of rapt, horrified attention, their eyes shifting from the expert witnesses to the man who sat at the defense table, his hands folded in his lap, his demeanor unchanged by the weight of the evidence that was sealing his fate. It was a masterclass in the power of modern investigative science, a demonstration that the past, no matter how distant, is never truly lost to those who know how to ask the right questions of the earth, the dust, and the silence. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterful synthesis of the entire investigation, a narrative that wove the cold, technical facts into a story of human betrayal that was almost too difficult to process. They didn't focus on the monster he had become. They focused on the man he had always been, the brother, the neighbor, the member of the community who had looked into his sister's eyes and decided that her life was less important than his own secret. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and absolute, as the prosecutor painted the picture of the night in 1985, bringing the jury into the house, into the room, and into the final, horrific moments of the victim's life. The impact was palpable, a collective shiver moving through the gallery, a sense that they were all witnessing the formal, judicial termination of an evil that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The jury's deliberations were expected to be lengthy. Given the volume of the evidence and the historical significance of the case, but their verdict returned with a speed that startled the court. When the foreperson stood, their voice was steady, clear, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Guilty, they said, and then again and again, for every charge, every count, every moment of the tragedy that had been dragged into the light. As the word echoed off the high, paneled walls of the courtroom, the reaction in the gallery was not one of jubilation, but of a profound, hollowed-out relief. The family sat perfectly still, their faces masked by the exhaustion of decades, a sense of finality washing over them that was as heavy as a stone. The brother, however, did not flinch. He remained seated, his gaze fixed on the table, as if he were waiting for the final, procedural steps of a process he had been watching from the sidelines his entire life. The sentencing phase followed shortly thereafter, a series of victim impact statements that turned the courtroom into a place of raw, unfiltered agony. The surviving relatives stepped to the stand, their voices breaking as they spoke of the woman they had lost, not just to a crime, but to the silence of their own family. They spoke of the empty chairs at the table, the lost milestones, the life that had been stolen before it had a chance to truly begin. They spoke of the betrayal, the way the brother had sat with them, had comforted them, had used their grief as a shield to protect himself from the law. Their words were a brutal, honest accounting of the cost of a secret, a ledger of suffering that no prison sentence could ever truly balance. The suspect listened, his expressionless face finally cracking with the slightest, most fleeting flicker of something, whether it was remorse, fear, or merely the realization of his own ruin, it was impossible to say. The judge, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, delivered the sentence with the heavy, rhythmic authority of an official who had finally fulfilled his mandate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the only sentence that fit the magnitude of the betrayal, the only conclusion that could provide even the most minimal sense of justice for the family and the town. As the judge spoke, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the gravity of the sentence sinking into the floorboards. The brother was finally removed from the room, his figure shrinking as he was led away through the heavy, swinging doors, and for the first time in 32 years, the shadow that had been cast over the town began, truly, to recede. But the conclusion of the trial did not mean the conclusion of the trauma. The days that followed the verdict were marked by a strange, quiet disquiet, as if the town were attempting to wake up from a dream that was far too vivid to forget. The news cycle moved on, the cameras vanished, and the normalcy of the suburb began to assert itself again, but it was a normalcy that felt brittle, a surface-level restoration that masked the deep, interior changes that had occurred in everyone who had lived through the ordeal. They were no longer the people they had been in 1985, nor were they the people they had been before the arrest. They were something else entirely, a community that had looked into the abyss of its own history and had seen the face of its own darkness. The forensic team, their job completed, returned to their labs and their offices, their work on the case now a closed chapter in their long, impressive careers. They knew that they would be haunted by the details, by the journals, and by the image of the brother as he sat at the defense table, but they also felt the deep, abiding peace of a mystery solved. They were the ones who had stayed at their desks, who had looked at the samples, who had pushed the technology to its limits, and they had finally seen the truth win. It was a victory, but it was a victory that had been won at the cost of the town's innocence. They were the architects of the resolution, and they carried the burden of that role with a quiet, professional pride that no public acknowledgement could ever truly replicate. As the weeks passed, the town slowly entered a period of post-trial processing, a time where they tried to find a language for what they had lived through. They held meetings, they organized forums, and they spoke in hushed, serious tones about the need to be more vigilant, to be more connected, and to understand the people who lived on their block. They were attempting to build a system of social awareness that would act as an early warning system for the kind of darkness that had once taken root in their backyard. It was a forward-thinking, protective effort, a commitment to ensuring that the history of 1985 would never, ever be repeated. They were trying to transform their trauma into a structure for survival, an attempt to make the future safer by learning the lessons of the past. The brothers' house, now effectively abandoned, sat as a stark, physical reminder of the crime. The neighbors avoided it, The weeds began to grow through the cracks in the driveway, and it seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, a monument to the failure of their collective perception. It was a place that everyone looked at, but no one saw, a spatial dead zone where the memory of the crime was more real than the wood and the stone. It was a piece of the landscape that had been corrupted, a physical manifestation of the lie that had existed for so long. And yet, there was a sense that this, too, would eventually change. The time would come when the house would be cleared, when the ground would be leveled, and when the memory of the crime would be subsumed into the larger, healthier history of the community. The family, in the quiet aftermath, turned inward. They found strength in each other, a new, more profound sense of solidarity that had been forged in the crucible of the trial. They were the survivors of a lifelong deception, the ones who had carried the deepest, most personal burden of the mystery. They found solace in the simple, mundane acts of existence, the things they had been denied for so long, the ability to speak openly, the ability to trust, the ability to remember the victim without the suffocating, distorted presence of the brother. They were the ones who had truly borne the cost of the justice that had finally arrived, and in their own way, they were the ones who were leading the town toward its new, more honest future. They were the keepers of the truth, and they carried it with a quiet, solemn grace that was the most powerful response possible to the act that had defined their lives for so long. The trial was a climax, a definitive moment of resolution, but as the dust settled, the town realized that the trial was not the end of the story. The story was the life that came after, the life that had to be built, brick by painful brick, from the remnants of the past. They were a community that had been broken, and in the process of putting the pieces back together, they had discovered that the new shape of their life was stronger, more resilient, and more deeply aware of the complexities of the human heart than anything they had known before. They had reached the end of the investigation, the end of the legal process, and the end of the mystery, but they had also arrived at the beginning of a life that was fundamentally, irrevocably changed, a life that was no longer lived in the shadow of the cold case, but in the light of an undeniable, difficult, and profoundly necessary truth. The stillness that settled over the town following the sentencing of the brother was not the peaceful silence of resolution. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a cemetery at midnight. The trial had ripped the bandage off a festering wound, and now the community was left to stare, unblinkingly, at the reality of what lay beneath. The absence of the brother, the finality of his incarceration, did not act as a cure. Instead, it served as a catalyst for a period of radical, painful recalibration. For the residents who had walked these streets for decades, the geography of their lives had been fundamentally altered. The familiar landmarks of the suburb, the neighborhood park, the high school athletic field, the long stretches of quiet lanes, no longer held the same meaning. They were now sites of memory, checkpoints in a narrative that had been rewritten by the cold, hard facts of the courtroom. The family, the survivors of this long-gestating betrayal, retreated into a life of guarded introspection. They were the ones who had to navigate the most complex aftermath, having to reconcile the images of the man they had loved and trusted with the reality of the man who had been condemned. Their existence became a quiet, private study in the anatomy of grief. They began to dismantle the remnants of their shared past, boxing up memories, selling the house, and trying to create a distance between themselves and the physical spaces that held the ghosts of the tragedy. It was a process of cleansing, an attempt to scrub the narrative of their own lives clean of the stain the brother had left behind. They were not just mourning the girl, they were mourning the entire, falsified history of their family, a history that had been constructed with the bricks of deceit and the mortar of a lifelong lie. The detectives, meanwhile, transitioned into the strange, purgatorial space that follows the resolution of a long-term investigation. They were the ones who had lived the case, who had spent decades mapping the suspect's life and the victim's absence, and now that the map was finished, they felt an unsettling sense of drift. They returned to their daily duties, the traffic stops, the mundane reports, the routine patrol of a town that looked exactly the same but felt entirely different, but they carried the weight of the 1985 case with them like a permanent shadow. They knew, better than anyone, that the resolution was not a cure. They had successfully navigated the legal process, but they had also witnessed the destruction of a human life and the shattering of a family, and these experiences did not simply vanish when the gavel struck. They were the sentinels of the truth, and they knew that the truth had a cost, a price that had been paid in the currency of the town's innocence. As the weeks turned into months, the town's social life began to undergo a quiet, subtle shift. The initial, sharp-edged trauma started to soften, replaced by a more mature, guarded way of engaging with one another. The residents stopped assuming the best of everyone, not out of a sense of cynicism, but out of a necessary, newly acquired wisdom. They began to look for the nuances, the inconsistencies, and the hidden depths in the people around them. It was a more complex, more adult way of living, a departure from the idealized suburbia that had characterized their lives before the secrets were unearthed. They were learning, painfully and slowly, that human beings are fundamentally mysterious, and that the masks we wear can sometimes be so perfect that we forget they are masks at all. The media, having extracted the peak drama of the trial, eventually migrated to the next spectacle, leaving the town to deal with the quiet, persistent residue of the attention. There was a sense of relief in this departure, as if the town were finally being allowed to mourn in private, without the intrusive glare of the external world. They began to reclaim their narrative, shifting the focus from the act of the crime to the persistence of the community. Small, spontaneous memorials started to appear, a bouquet of flowers left by the side of the road, a small, handwritten note tucked into the bark of an old tree, not as grand, performative statements, but as quiet, personal acts of acknowledgement. They were the first signs of a community that was starting to process its reality on its own terms, moving away from the manufactured drama of the news cycle and toward the necessary, messy, and deeply personal work of healing. The house, that silent witness to the 32-year secret, became the focus of the community's desire for renewal. There was a collective push, a whisper that grew into a groundswell, to see the structure removed, to see the ground cleared, and the history erased. It was an instinctive, emotional response, a way of signaling that they were ready to leave the nightmare behind. When the demolition finally happened, it was a strangely quiet affair. There was no cheering, no celebration. There was only the sound of heavy machinery, the crunch of wood and brick, and the eventual, stark sight of an empty, vacant lot. As the dust settled and the debris was carted away, the residents watched from a distance, a sense of collective release rippling through the crowd. The house was gone, and with it, the physical anchor of the trauma, leaving behind a scarred, open patch of earth that felt, for the first time, as though it could eventually contain something new. In the precinct, the investigative team began the process of closing the final, remaining files. They were meticulous, ensuring that every detail was documented, every loose end tied, and every piece of evidence cataloged for the last time. It was a ritual of completion, a way of formalizing the end of the case that had defined their professional lives. As they locked the files away in the basement archive, they felt a sense of profound, exhausted closure. They had done everything they could. They had reached the end of the line, and they had arrived at the truth. There was no more to be said, no more to be done. The case that had haunted the department for 32 years was now just a record, a story to be told to the next generation of officers as a testament to the importance of persistence. The town, meanwhile, entered the late stages of the year, the trees losing their leaves and the air turning sharp and cold. It was the time of reflection, a season that seemed to mirror the internal state of the residents. They were in the middle of a long, difficult process of reintegrating their reality, of finding a way to live with the knowledge of what had happened. They were no longer the people they had been in 1985, nor were they the people who had felt the initial, visceral shock of the arrest. They were somewhere in between, a community that was wounded but determined, a community that was learning to carry its history without being defined by it. They were a people who had been through the fire and were now, slowly, beginning to understand what they had become in the process. The victim's name, once a whispered secret and then a headline, finally began to settle into the collective memory as something more than just a case. It was becoming a part of the town's legacy, a name that was now spoken with a quiet, respectful gravity. She was no longer just the victim of the brother. She was the young girl who had lived, who had laughed, and who had been lost. The process of humanizing her, of moving past the horror of the crime to the reality of her life, was perhaps the most important part of the town's recovery. They were reclaiming her from the cold, clinical pages of the evidence log and restoring her to the fabric of their lives. As the year drew to a close, the sense of equilibrium continued to deepen. The town had survived the trial, the media, the revelations, and the slow, agonizing process of dismantling their shared history, and they were still standing. The secrets had been unearthed, the truth had been spoken, and the consequences had been felt. There were no more mysteries to solve, no more shadows to investigate, and no more secrets to protect. The town was left with the reality of itself, a community of individuals who had been through an unthinkable ordeal and who were now, step by step, finding their way back to a sense of normal. It was a modest, hard-won normalcy, a normalcy that was tempered by the knowledge of what had occurred, but a normalcy that was nonetheless real. The final days of the year were marked by a profound, quiet gratitude. The residents were looking toward the future, their gaze clear and steady. They had learned the hardest, most necessary lesson that a community can ever face, that the truth is the only foundation upon which a real life can be built. They had lost their innocence, they had paid a devastating price, but they had also gained a sense of clarity and purpose that they had never possessed before. They were ready to move forward, not by forgetting, but by remembering, by holding the truth in their hands, no matter how heavy it might be, and by choosing, every single day, to step toward the light. The cold case was finally, truly in the past, and for the first time in 32 years, the town could look ahead toward a horizon that was open, unburdened, and entirely, beautifully their own. The arrival of 2026, over 4 decades since the 1985 disappearance and nearly a decade since the truth finally ripped through the town, feels like a different era. The streets of Yanfeng, once haunted by the spectral presence of an unsolved mystery, have been reclaimed by the mundane, rhythmic beauty of daily life. The houses that were once the sites of whispered secrets and suspicious glances are now homes to new families, people who moved here long after the media circus had folded its tents and the final gavel had struck. The town has not forgotten the events of 1985, but the memory has ceased to be an active, open wound. It has undergone a strange, alchemical transformation. It is now part of the foundational history, a dark chapter that explains why the community values transparency and connection above all else. The former investigators, the men and women who lived through the long, agonizing purgatory of the cold case, are now the town's elders. They meet in the quiet of the morning, their pace slowed by the passage of time, their discussions less about the mechanics of evidence and more about the philosophy of survival. They have a perspective that is rare and precious. They saw the town at its most broken, and they saw it at its most resilient. They are the keepers of the narrative, ensuring that the younger generations don't just learn the facts of the crime, but the lessons of the aftermath. They remind everyone that justice is not just a verdict, it is an ongoing maintenance of the social contract. Their presence is a reminder that the truth is never truly out of reach, provided there is the collective will to keep searching. In the state's Forensic Center, the 1985 file remains the standard-bearer for investigative excellence. New technicians, trained in the latest advancements of biometric analysis and data modeling, still visit the archives to study the methodology that finally linked the brother to the crime. It is a legendary file, a case study in the power of patience. They look at the old photographs, the grainy Polaroids of a teenage girl, and they see more than just a case number. They see a person whose dignity was eventually restored by the relentless, grinding work of the system. The file serves as a moral compass for the lab. It teaches them that no matter how much time passes, the integrity of the evidence is paramount. It is the gold standard for every cold case investigation in the state, a permanent monument to the belief that the past can indeed be corrected. The perpetrator, long since relegated to the anonymity of the maximum security system, has essentially ceased to exist as a social or cultural figure. His life has become a series of gray, uniform days, his existence entirely stripped of the power and control he once wielded through a secret. He is the ultimate, pathetic monument to his own hubris, a man who thought he was smarter than the truth, only to be dismantled by the very science he ignored for decades. The prison facility, a stark, monolithic structure far from the town he scarred, is his final reality. He is an echo, a name in a ledger, a man who gave up 32 years of his life to keep a secret that only ended up becoming his own tomb. There is no triumph in his incarceration, only the grim, satisfying reality that justice, while often delayed, is as inexorable as gravity. The survivors, the family members who carried the double burden of losing a daughter and being betrayed by a son, have moved into a period of life that can only be described as a hard one, serene grace. They have found that the passage of time, while it cannot erase the pain, can certainly reshape its contours. They have seen children and grandchildren flourish. They have lived through the ordinary, beautiful milestones of existence, and they have done so with a sense of quiet, abiding strength. They are the soul of the community, the people who have shown everyone else that the human heart is capable of breaking and yet, in the right conditions, capable of knitting itself back together. Their influence is woven into the very fabric of the town's civic life, a silent, powerful reminder of the resilience of those who have been through the unthinkable. The town's architecture, too, has evolved to reflect this new reality. The site where the family house once stood is now part of an expanded community garden, a place where people come to harvest vegetables, sit on benches, and watch the sun go down. The history of the site is known, but it is not the defining feature. It is a place of productivity, of life, and of the peaceful, shared rhythms of the residents. It is a victory of the present over the past, a way of signaling that the town is no longer tethered to its trauma, but is actively participating in the beauty of the life that has blossomed in its wake. It is a garden that produces, in every sense of the word, and it is perhaps the most fitting response to the act of destruction that once occurred there. As the months progress into the heat of the summer, the town feels profoundly, remarkably stable. The systems of social awareness, the neighborhood networks, the school programs, the community-led initiatives are so thoroughly integrated into the daily life of Yanfeng that they are practically invisible. People interact with a blend of openness and grounded perception. They understand the fragility of their peace, and they have developed the habits necessary to protect it. They are a community that is awake, an organism that is sensitive to the subtle shifts in its social environment. They have learned that the greatest protection against darkness is not a heightened state of fear, but a high-functioning state of connection. The Forensic Laboratories Public Outreach Program, the Truth Foundation, has become a national model for transparency. They work with families all over the country, teaching them the value of record-keeping, the ethics of investigation, and the fundamental right to know the truth about their own history. The town has become a resource, a beacon for others who are navigating the long, dark, and difficult path of an unsolved disappearance. The people here have learned that their experience, while painful, is also a source of great, practical wisdom. They have transformed their own tragedy into a gift for others, ensuring that the legacy of 1985 is not just one of loss, but one of empowerment and clarity. Looking back on this 40-year arc, from the humid night in 1985 to this serene moment in 2026, the progress is truly breathtaking. The town had traveled from a state of innocence, through the abyss of a hidden betrayal, and into a state of profound, mature awareness. It is a journey that has demanded everything of them: their trust, their peace of mind, their sense of security, but it has also delivered a clarity that is as deep as it is enduring. They know the truth of their past, they understand a reality of their present, and they are moving toward their future with a stride that is steady, confident, and entirely unburdened. There is a sense of absolute finality in the air of this town in 2026. The secrets have all been spoken, the evidence has been fully interpreted, and the story has been told until there is nothing left to say. The case that once held the town in a state of suspended animation, the case that had acted as a ceiling on their collective growth, is gone. They have broken through that ceiling, and they are living in the wide, open air of a reality that they have defined for themselves. It is a reality that is beautiful because it is honest, and it is honest because it has been tested by the most difficult truth of all. In the final, quiet hours of this day, the town stands as a testament to the fact that justice, in its most profound sense, is not just the result of a legal process, but the result of a communal one. They have taken the broken pieces of their history, and they have built something that is both beautiful and structurally sound. Their home. The cold case is finally, truly, in the past, and for the first time in 4 decades, the town is living not in the shadow of what they lost, but in the brilliant, unhurried light of who they have become. They move forward, not by forgetting, but by continuing to grow, to care, and to choose, in every small, daily action, to keep the light shining, knowing that they have finally and forever reached the end of the long road back to the truth. The passage of time is the most relentless sculptor of human history. As we stand in the midsummer of 2026, the year 1985 has receded into the deep, quiet annals of the town's collective memory, becoming less a recurring nightmare and more a foundational pillar of their identity. The town, having lived through the long, agonizing aftermath of the brothers' arrest and the subsequent trial, has arrived at a state of profound, mature equilibrium. It is a place that feels physically and psychologically different, as if the very air has been scrubbed clean of the secrets that once hung in the humid, stagnant atmosphere of the 80s. The houses on the quiet lanes where the victim and her brother once walked have been renovated, expanded, and filled with the laughter of new generations, children who possess no visceral memory of the panic, the police tape, or the suffocating suspicion that once dictated the rhythm of daily existence. The Pocket Park, the site of the former family home, has matured into a tranquil, leafy sanctuary. It is a space of extraordinary, understated beauty where the oak tree, planted in the early years of the restoration, now looms large, its branches a wide, sheltering canopy. It has become the town's living room, a place where the history of the site is acknowledged not through a plaque of somber remembrance, but through the vibrant, ongoing life of the community. In the mornings, you might see the detectives who once spent sleepless nights poring over those brittle, yellowed files, now sitting on the benches, watching their grandchildren chase pigeons. They represent the bridge between the town's fractured past and its stable present, a living record of the struggle it took to reach this point of quiet. They rarely speak of the 1985 file anymore, not because they have forgotten, but because the file has done its work. The truth has been spoken, the debt has been paid, and the case has been laid to rest. In the state's Forensic Center, the 1985 file exists as a digitized, high-resolution monument to the power of scientific persistence. It is the curriculum, the gold standard, the story every new recruit learns within their first week on the job. They learn that the boundary between a case that will define a career and a case that will be forgotten by history is often just a matter of timing and a refusal to accept the limits of current technology. The success of the 1985 investigation has become the foundational myth of the department, a narrative that reinforces the professional ethos of every analyst and investigator working there. They treat every strand of hair, every scrap of fabric, and every fragment of data with a reverence born from the knowledge that, one day, they might be the ones to finally pull a truth out of the silence. The brother, who was the center of the storm and the architect of the betrayal, has essentially ceased to exist as a social entity. Within the walls of the maximum security system, he is a ghost, a name in a bureaucratic index, an aging inmate whose life has been stripped of all the artifice and manipulation that once sustained him. He is the ultimate, cautionary realization of a life squandered on a falsehood. The prison system, efficient and indifferent, has effectively erased him. He does not influence the town, he does not shadow the lives of the survivors, and he no longer occupies the space in their minds that he once did. He is a completed task, a solved equation, a remnant of a darker age that has been successfully moved into the past. His existence is a testament to the fact that evil, when finally stripped of its secrecy, is remarkably mundane, fragile, and temporary. The victims' families, meanwhile, have become the town's quiet moral authority. They have moved through the phases of their tragedy with a grace that has been nothing short of extraordinary. They have found that while grief is a permanent companion, it can be transmuted from a destructive force into a source of immense, sustaining wisdom. They are the ones who show up at the local school board meetings, who champion the local mental health initiatives, and who support the scholarship fund they established years ago. They are a presence of profound, steady strength, a group of people who've been through the fire and emerged, not as victims, but as guardians of the community's future. Their existence is a living refutation of the brothers' attempt to destroy them, a long-term, unfolding victory that is written in the lives of their children and the quiet, productive work they do every day. The town's social fabric, once frayed and suspicious, is now incredibly robust. The residents of 2026 operate with a sense of connection that is both intentional and effortless. They understand that the protection of their community is not just a police matter, but a communal responsibility. The neighborhood network, an outgrowth of the trauma they endured, is now a seamless part of their civic life. People look out for one another, not out of a nagging sense of paranoia, but out of a genuine, neighborly regard. It is a beautiful, grounded way of living, a realization that the most effective barrier against darkness is not a high fence or a locked door, but the simple, consistent act of being present for those around you. They have built a culture of transparency that is deeply rooted in their history, a way of living that honors the truth by making it the central pillar of their daily existence. As the years continue to unfold, the case of 1985 has transitioned from a harrowing piece of news into a cautionary piece of civic history. It is a story that is told in schools, in town halls, and in the quiet conversations between neighbors, not as a way to incite fear, but as a way to reinforce their commitment to one another. They use the history of the case to talk about the dangers of unchecked ego, the importance of questioning the narratives we take for granted, and the transformative power of a community that refuses to give up on its own. It is a story that has been fully integrated into their identity, a narrative that they have reclaimed from the media and from the criminal, and molded into something that serves the future rather than chaining them to the past. The digital archive of the investigation, accessible and meticulously organized, continues to be a source of learning for the entire nation. It is a repository of methodology, of ethics, and of the profound emotional intelligence required to lead a community through such a protracted ordeal. The Forensic Laboratories Public Outreach Program, the Truth Foundation, has become a vital hub for families across the country who are struggling with their own cold cases. They come to Yen Fong to learn how to keep their stories alive, how to advocate for their missing loved ones, and how to maintain the pressure that eventually forces the truth to the surface. The town has become a beacon, a place where people who have lost everything go to learn how to fight for the one thing that still remains: the truth. Looking back on this 40-year arc, the sense of accomplishment that permeates the town is almost palpable. They have traveled an incredible distance from the humid, terrifying chaos of 1985 to the clear, settled reality of 2026. They have lived through the nightmare, they have done the work, and they have reached the shore. There is a sense of absolute finality in the air. The secrets have been spoken, the evidence has been fully realized, and the story has been lived until it is complete. The long, agonizing search that once held the community in a state of suspended animation is now a finished, foundational part of their history. They are a community that knows who they are because they know exactly what they have survived. As the final light of this day settles over the streets, casting a warm, golden glow across the houses and the gardens, there is a profound sense that everything is in its proper place. The town looks out toward the future with a gaze that is entirely unburdened by the ghosts of the past. The cold case is finally, truly, in the history books, and the town is living, moving, and breathing in the brilliant, unhurried light of its own restoration. They are whole, they are together, and they are, finally and irrevocably, at peace. The mystery is over, the silence has been broken, and the truth has done its work. The town moves forward, not in fear, but with the steady, confident stride of a people who have reclaimed their own destiny, ready to face whatever tomorrow brings with the strength of a truth that will never again be kept in the dark. The narrative trajectory of the town in these summer months of 2026 feels less like a progression of years and more like the culmination of a decades-long spiritual and social arc. The shadow of the 1985 disappearance, once a sprawling, suffocating presence that seemed to consume the very oxygen of the neighborhood, has been entirely replaced by a culture of radical transparency. The Pocket Park, built on the site of the former family home, has become more than just a green space. It is a center of gravity for the community. Here, in the early mornings, the silence is not the heavy, anxious silence of the past, but a light, observant silence. It is a space where the history of the site is not erased but honored through the simple, persistent act of collective living. No statues stand here, no plaques detailing the horror. Instead, the community has filled the void with the sounds of children playing and the steady, rhythmic conversation of neighbors who have learned that the best way to defy a legacy of trauma is to cultivate a present of undeniable vitality. In the forensic archives, the 1985 case remains the most cited example of how the evolution of technology serves as an agent of moral reckoning. The methods that finally secured the conviction, the integration of familial DNA markers, the exhaustive digital mapping of the suspect's movements, and the meticulous reprocessing of decades-old samples, have become the baseline for all subsequent investigations. The laboratory staff, who often find themselves training new recruits, emphasize that the technology is only as effective as the integrity of the investigation. They point to the 1985 case as the pinnacle of this philosophy, the moment when the system finally caught up to the secret. For these scientists and investigators, the case is a living curriculum, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a sprint, but an endurance test, a marathon where the finish line is the inevitable, often agonizing, but ultimately clarifying moment of the truth. The perpetrator, now a spectral figure in the depths of the state's maximum security prison, has become entirely disconnected from the reality of the town he once deceived. His isolation is absolute. He is a man out of time, his internal world limited to the monotonous, rigid boundaries of his cell and the memory of the life he threw away. He serves as a grim, silent monument to the futility of his own darkness. To the younger generation of the town, his name is a trivia point, a historical factoid that lacks the visceral, gut-wrenching impact it held for those who lived through the 90s. This transition from a source of terror to a forgotten, cautionary figure is perhaps the most significant indicator of the town's success in reclaiming its narrative. The man who once held their sense of safety in his hands now has no hands at all, metaphorically speaking. He is a man who has ceased to have any meaningful impact on the world, a realization that is perhaps the ultimate, silent judgment of his existence. The victims' families continue to move through their lives with a profound, quiet dignity that serves as the moral center of the neighborhood. They have transitioned from being the survivors of the mystery to becoming the town's most respected advocates for communal health. The Scholarship Fund, which has supported over 100 students in the fields of forensic science and social advocacy, is a testament to the way they have repurposed their tragedy. Watching these students, many of whom have gone on to careers in law enforcement and victim advocacy, the families feel a sense of completion that is not about forgetting the past, but about building a future that is fundamentally more protective than the one they were promised. Their journey, from the agonizing, open-ended trauma of 1985 to this period of integrated, purposeful living, is a profound, masterclass example of the resilience of the human heart. The town's social structure in 2026 is characterized by a high-functioning, almost intuitive sense of mutual vigilance. The neighborhood networks, initially born out of the suspicion that followed the brothers' arrest, have evolved into a sophisticated system of communal support. They share information, they monitor the well-being of the elderly and the vulnerable, and they maintain a culture of open, honest communication. They have effectively dismantled the isolation that allowed a predator to hide in plain sight for 32 years. They have learned that the most effective way to be safe is not to lock one's doors, but to know the people who live behind the ones next door. This communal intelligence is the greatest safeguard they possess, an invisible, constant, and incredibly effective barrier against any future incursions of darkness. Technological integration in the town has reached a point where it serves as a silent, efficient partner in the maintenance of public peace. The data sharing networks, which integrate emergency services with localized community alerts, are managed with a level of oversight that respects the privacy of the individual while ensuring the safety of the collective. The residents are no longer afraid of these tools. They are the architects of their implementation. They understand that the digital age provides the speed and the precision necessary to combat the kinds of threats that would have been ignored in the mid-80s. They have mastered the balance between the human and the mechanical, ensuring that the technology always serves the community's best interests and never the other way around. The education system has remained committed to the integration of the 1985 case into their civics curriculum, but the focus has shifted entirely toward the themes of civic responsibility and justice. Students aren't just learning about DNA sequencing. They are learning about the ethics of investigation, the importance of questioning the status quo, and the vital role of the citizen in the administration of justice. They are graduating as informed, aware, and highly principled members of society, possessing a level of sophistication regarding the complexities of their town's history that is truly remarkable. They are the ones who will carry the narrative forward, ensuring that the lessons of the past are never lost and that the vigilance of the present is maintained for as long as they are the stewards of the community. As the decade of the 20s draws toward its conclusion, the atmosphere in the town is one of total, integrated equilibrium. It is a place that feels deeply, fundamentally settled. The traumatic, high-energy oscillation of the post-trial years has faded, replaced by the steady, reliable heartbeat of a community that has successfully navigated the most difficult experience imaginable. They are no longer a community defined by a crime. They are a community defined by their endurance, their intelligence, and their refusal to let the darkness of the past determine the scope of their future. They live with the understanding that they have won their own peace, and that it is a peace that must be tended to, protected, and honored every single day. The story, as it lingers in the collective consciousness of the community, is one of total, comprehensive reclamation. They have reclaimed their history, their sense of safety, their trust in one another, and their ability to live without the suffocating presence of a secret. The cold case, once an open-ended mystery that felt like a permanent tear in the fabric of their lives, has been neatly, definitively, and forever closed. They have seen the light of the truth, they have felt the heat of the fire, and they have walked out onto the other side, stronger and more whole than they ever could have been had the darkness never tested them. In the final hours of this June day, as the sun dips below the horizon, the town is bathed in a warm, golden light that seems to highlight the strength and the clarity of everything within it. There is a profound sense of completeness here, a feeling that the work is finished, the record is balanced, and the truth has done everything it was meant to do. The town, in all its flawed, resilient, and enduring humanity, moves toward the future with a steady, unhurried pace. The secret is no longer a burden. It is a lesson. The mystery is no longer a void. It is a closed file. The community, finally and for the first time in 4 decades, is entirely, unequivocally at home. The truth, in the end, has been their salvation, a beacon that guided them through the long, dark, and difficult passage, and the light that now shines, brilliant and unburdened, on the road ahead. They are safe, they are connected, and they are, above all else, finally free. As we reach the 10th year following the final conviction and look back from the vantage point of this summer in 2026, the town of Yanfeng and the broader narrative of the 1985 cold case have entered a phase of profound, historical solidification. The passage of time has acted as a final, clarifying agent, washing away the acute, jagged edges of the initial shock and leaving behind a smooth, weathered landscape of understanding. The community today bears little resemblance to the one that stood trembling on the brink of collapse back when the truth first surfaced. The trauma that once threatened to define every interaction, every policy, and every sense of self has been transmuted into a stable, structural wisdom. The Pocket Park, that lush, vibrant green space that replaced the site of the former family home, is no longer a site of pilgrimage or a curiosity for the morbidly inclined. It is a space of mundane, vital activity. The oak tree, now a towering sentinel, anchors the neighborhood with its deep roots, a living symbol of what it means to grow out of the very ground that was once scorched by the fire of tragedy. The investigators who spearheaded the final, successful push for the truth now sit in the quiet, reflective twilight of their careers. They are no longer the frantic, high-pressure protagonists of the news cycle. They are the mentors, the sages, the men and women who have transitioned into a state of quiet service. In their occasional, relaxed meetings at the local coffee shop, they rarely speak of the forensics or the legal strategy of 1985. Instead, they talk of the people, the survivors who rebuilt their lives, the students who now study the case as a matter of academic interest, and the way the town itself has managed to evolve. They have done their duty. They have fulfilled the promise that every officer makes but few have the chance to keep, to never abandon a victim to the dark. This realization, settled deep in their bones, provides a foundation of professional and personal peace that few who work in the crucible of justice ever truly attain. In the state's Forensic Center, the 1985 file remains the foundational text of modern investigative rigor. It is no longer just a cold case. It is a benchmark. It is a source of study for the next generation, who view the archive not as a tragedy, but as a masterpiece of persistence. They look at the DNA sequencing, the genealogical mapping, and the painstakingly recovered documents as a map of the path forward. The laboratory itself has become a place where the concept of the impossible is systematically dismantled. Every breakthrough that occurs in the present, every missing person identified, every cold file finally sealed, is a quiet, secondary tribute to the girl who disappeared in 1985. The staff works with a sense of mission that is both professional and profound, knowing that the techniques they deploy are the direct result of the lessons learned during that grueling, multi-year struggle to unmask the brother. The perpetrator, meanwhile, is an entirely forgotten entity. Within the monolithic, gray confines of the state's maximum security prison, he has become a ghost, a name on a piece of paper that holds no weight for anyone outside the facility's walls. He is a man who is utterly consumed by the secret he kept, his entire existence distilled down to the sterile, repetitive architecture of his cell. The town, which once felt his shadow in every street and every store, has effectively deleted him from its reality. He is not a monster in their eyes. He is a non-factor. He is a lesson in the failure of the human spirit when it is stripped of truth, a man who gave up 32 years of his life and his own soul to protect a lie that ultimately, inevitably, failed him. The prison system treats him with indifference he deserves, a body to be maintained, a number to be tracked, a man whose presence in the world has absolutely no meaning. The victims' families have achieved a state of post-traumatic blooming that is nothing short of breathtaking. They have built a life that is robust, honest, and profoundly resilient. Their grief, once a sharp, incapacitating knife, has softened into a steady, constant companionship, a way of honoring the life that was lost while continuing to embrace the life that remains. They have watched their families expand, they have seen the town change, and they have remained the steady, moral heart of their community. Their influence is visible in every civic initiative that promotes transparency and communal support. They have taken the most destructive experience a human can endure and turned it into a source of enduring, life-affirming strength. They are the ones who show the town that the past, while inescapable, is not a prison. They have chosen to be free, and in doing so, they have set an example for everyone who has ever had to carry the weight of a great loss. The town's civic and social life in 2026 is a study in the power of collective intelligence. The neighborhood networks, which began as a response to the suspicion following the brothers' arrest, have matured into a permanent, high-functioning system of social maintenance. They possess an intuitive understanding of the importance of connection. They recognize the signs of social isolation, they act on the concerns of their neighbors, and they foster a level of transparency that makes it impossible for secrets to take root. They have built a community where the strength of the collective is the primary deterrent against any future darkness. They don't live in a bubble of naive safety. They live in a state of high awareness, a grounded, pragmatic way of engaging with the world that acknowledges the potential for danger while maintaining an unwavering commitment to the health of the community. Technologically, the town has embraced the future as a partner in their protection. The data sharing platforms, the forensic literacy programs, and the advanced monitoring tools are integrated so smoothly into their daily lives that they are effectively invisible. They are not controlled by technology. They control it, using it to maintain the clarity and the transparency that they once had to fight so hard to achieve. It is a symbiotic relationship between the community and the tools they have mastered, ensuring that the speed and the precision of the modern world are always oriented toward the preservation of the truth. They are no longer victims of their environment. They are the stewards of it, and they manage their collective safety with the expertise and the dedication of people who know exactly what happens when that stewardship is neglected. The education system has remained the most vital engine of the town's evolution. By weaving the history of the 1985 case into their curriculum, they are training the next generation to be citizens who are defined by their awareness and their integrity. Students don't just learn about the tragedy. They learn about the processes of justice, the ethics of investigation, and the fundamental importance of the truth. They are raised to be protectors of their own community, possessors of a civic sophistication that is truly rare. They look at the oak tree in the pocket park, and they understand that their safety is not a guarantee, it is an achievement. They are growing up with the understanding that the most powerful thing they can ever possess is their own clarity and their own refusal to let the truth be buried. As the decade of the 20s draws to its inevitable, quiet close, the atmosphere in the town is one of total, integrated equilibrium. It is a place that feels deeply, fundamentally settled. The traumatic, high-energy oscillation of the post-trial years has faded, replaced by the steady, reliable heartbeat of a community that has successfully navigated the most difficult experience imaginable. They are no longer a community defined by a crime. They are a community defined by their endurance, their intelligence, and their refusal to let the darkness of the past determine the scope of their future. They live with the understanding that they have won their own peace, and that it is a peace that must be tended to, protected, and honored every single day. The story, as it lingers in the collective consciousness of the community, is one of total, comprehensive reclamation. They have reclaimed their history, their sense of safety, their trust in one another, and their ability to live without the suffocating presence of a secret. The cold case, once an open-ended mystery that felt like a permanent tear in the fabric of their lives, has been neatly, definitively, and forever closed. They have seen the light of the truth, they have felt the heat of the fire, and they have walked out onto the other side, stronger and more whole than they ever could have been had the darkness never tested them. In the final, quiet hours of this decade, as the sun dips below the horizon, the town is bathed in a warm, golden light that seems to highlight the strength and the clarity of everything within it. There is a profound sense of completeness here, a feeling that the work is finished, the record is balanced, and the truth has done everything it was meant to do. The town, in all its flawed, resilient, and enduring humanity, moves toward the future with a steady, unhurried pace. The secret is no longer a burden. It is a lesson. The mystery is no longer a void. It is a closed file. The community, finally and for the first time in 4 decades, is entirely, unequivocally at home. The truth, in the end, has been their salvation, a beacon that guided them through the long, dark, and difficult passage, and the light that now shines, brilliant and unburdened, on the road ahead. They are safe, they are connected, and they are, finally and irrevocably, at peace.